Hi shmai, sitachi croeso Chris Dowie. What is cracking, ladies, gents, boys, girls, anyone who is anyone. Today I would love to welcome you to my little channel, where today it is a little bit of a special video because we're talking about Crystal of Storms. It's a fighting fantasy novel, but it's a little bit special because as far as I'm aware, this is the last one by Scholastic. I don't know if they got plans to reprint any new ones, to publish out any new stories or whatever. So yeah, this might actually be the last modern game book that I actually cover. But fear not, I do have plans for fighting fantasy content in the future. But I'm going to go into it towards the end of the video, just so that I can just talk about Crystal of Storms, what you're here for, and then explain that. So without further ado, let's get into the book itself. So this book was written, well I say written, is published back in 2020. Wouldn't be a surprise if it was written like a year or two before. It was written by Rihanna Pratchett and it was illustrated by Eva E. I've massacred this woman's last name so many times, so many takes. I'm gonna leave their full name. Say full name, sounds like I'm doxing them. I'm going to put the name in the description so you can look into them, look at, I suppose, their portfolios if they have one online. I don't know. But yeah, it takes place in Pangaria in Titan. Now you might be looking at that and saying, well, that's not the place we know and love, Alanzia. No, it's not. And that's sort of like a problem that I'm going to get. I say a problem. It's one of the bigger problems. It is one of the elephants in the room, but I'm going to get into it shortly. So yeah, it's 400 references. It is, it's new. Look at the art style, look at the cover, which I'm going to go into shortly. I say shortly, I'm going to go into it next. It's a product of modern times, let's just say that. So let's actually talk about the cover. So 3, 2, 1, let's go. So the cover for this, I've pulled up a picture on the screen, and it is very, very purple. You got some ambiguous flying creature in the front. I don't know if this creature's ever specified. I don't know if there's artwork for this creature in the book. I didn't encounter any. And there's a concerned looking cloud thing. On top of that, there's a flying city. So from the artwork, you know, it's not my cup of tea. But if you're like more, I suppose, open-minded, I don't think it's open-minded. If this is more your type of artwork, this is quite enticing. For me, it's not. It's quite, like I said, a product of modern times, which isn't necessarily a good thing. But let's actually talk about the story. Now, the story itself really is where I found the most flaws. I'm going to turn the book around and read the back, and it says, "Are you brave enough to explore the ocean of tempests on the hunt for the floating isle of Nimbus, which suddenly crashed down out of the sky? There will be storms and sea beasts to battle in your mission to raise Nimbus from the deep, hunted by demonic harpies, rabid rats, and even a great white squark. You'll need every ounce of courage and quick wits to survive. May your stamina never fail." Now that actually sounds pretty good, you know. I read the back of the book before actually reading the book, and I was like, oh, I'm in for a treat. This sounds pretty cool. This you got a bit of creepy underwater exploration. You got a squark. The name is quite self-explanatory. It's a squid shark kind of thing. And there's floating cities. I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. That's quite interesting. The reality though for me, and if you're more of a fan of the older books, you're gonna maybe pick up on it if you open this book, is that this is a product of modern times. Now let me explain what I mean. Now what I mean is, if you like fantasy and you've been following it for the past 5 to 10 years, and I don't mean just following fantasy, that sounds weird, like having a pinboard filled with fantasy stuff, but if you're interested in fantasy, you might have noticed trends, and these trends seem to be outsiders who aren't interested in the genre as a whole, embedding themselves in the genre to sort of tear it apart from the inside out. And yeah, you get what I mean. It happened with gaming. It's happening with fantasy. I don't know how bad it is with fantasy because honestly, I just read the books. I'm not looking for people's tweets because I don't really like Twitter. Because at the end of the day, Twitter, it just seems to be like the radicalized left. But I digress. So you have these people sort of ramming real world politics into a setting where it doesn't really belong, and as a result, we've sort of watered down fantasy to the point where it's just crap. It's just paper thin, bland and boring. And when I say this book is a product of modern times, that's exactly what I mean. There's no orcs and there's no elves. It's literally just humans and goblins, and even then the goblin representation isn't faithful to how goblins have been represented in fighting fantasy books. So it's all just massively detached. And I don't know if it's because no guidance was actually provided to Rihanna Pratchett, or maybe she just hasn't read any previous fighting fantasy books. And I'm not trying to like start something here. It's just I don't understand where this book was coming from. It sort of came into the party and tried making it all about themselves, whilst being noticeably just not as good. This book by itself, if it was just a game book, not attached to fighting fantasy, yeah, it you know, it'll probably be alright. I wouldn't read it, but it'd probably be okay. But let's actually talk about the story, because I've been boring you guys long enough. So what is the story? The story is like a detective thing where you're just trying to find out why this island crashed out of the sky, and there's twists and turns throughout the book. You have some, I suppose, interesting one of them was surprisingly quite grim. I'm just gonna spoil it because it's really good. It's really good. It's getting me excited. So basically, you come across some guy. You know this guy, and he's got like an octopus on his head. He's got this octopus on his head. Think like the Gmods. Is it Gmod? Half-Life head crab kind of thing, those zombies. He's kind of like that, so you whack him and you knock the octopus off. And he's like, whoa, my guy, that was thanks for that. I don't know what happened. You interrogate him a little bit. And as you go to leave, he sort of cries out and you see there's these weird tentacles crawling underneath his skin. Now this was awesome. This was like fantastic writing by Rihanna Pratchett. I'm just going to start calling her Pratchett from now on because it feels too formal otherwise. And I'm doing it with respect, like don't get me wrong, but Pratchett writes the scene really, really well. It's really good. She could easily and fantastically maybe write the horror fighting fantasy book if she's in it for the long term, and it would be really good. I'd love it. But this scene in particular stood out to me because it's just fantastic. I think there's some nice encounters I believe there's a nice underwater encounter with like this giant anglerfish, and at least there is according to the artwork I've seen online. Spoilers, I pulled up a guide specifically to skip the underwater section because it was just getting on my nerves. It was just annoying. It's not so much like the mazes from maybe Firetop or Warlock or Firetop Mountain. It's just sort of like it tried doing too much, and it just wasn't really a fun reading experience. And the end encounter, I suppose the boss fight in this one was actually kind of cool. The boss goblin, who now sort of has that, there's no dwarves in this book either. He sort of takes over the dwarves for being like technologically super advanced, and builds this giant mech suit, and then you and another goblin fights him in like a giant mech suit. The end is actually kind of cool. It just doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit the bill when it comes down to fighting fantasy. I did enjoy it, but I think it would have been better in its own like adventure game book rather than a fighting fantasy game book, if you get what I mean. This book would be fine as a game book. It's just when it's a fighting fantasy game book, you expect there to be consistencies with previous fighting fantasy game books and like it all to like fit into the world, but it just sort of doesn't. It's sort of like in its own pocket dimension, where Pratchett has just sort of done whatever she felt like with it, and it just doesn't really fit. It doesn't really fit. The characters don't really stand out. They're all sort of like, they've all got silly names. All the goblins have that really annoying fake like Cockney accent that all like the TikTokers are using when they pretend to be, when they're LARPing as goblins. The characters are just sort of bland and boring. You got one guy who betrays you and you just get the option to kill him, so I was like, why not, may as well, YOLO. But the characters, none of them really stood out. None of them really felt as if like you'd be reading another book and you go, oh man, I wonder, you know, wouldn't it be cool if we saw so and so again? Because these characters are just kind of bland, one-dimensional, paper thin, and just boring. The setting was more or less the same, and the setting could have been interesting. It just wasn't explored thoroughly enough. You sort of jump from island to island, doing like a set amount of things, and then you just sort of progressed. It's just like just a really mediocre to bad entry into the fighting fantasy series. Now on Goodreads, I gave this book 2 out of 5. I think 2 out of 5 was fair, either 2 out of 5 or 3 out of 5. I hope I didn't give it 3 out of 5. Hopefully I gave it 2 out of 5, and I think that's fair. I think it's fair because, yeah, it's a game book, but it doesn't really feel like a fighting fantasy game book, and it just sort of feels like it's that crappy modern day fantasy where there's literally no danger and everyone's your friend, and it's like, that isn't why fantasy is good in the first place. To me, fantasy's always been interesting because there's danger around every corner. Yeah, you're with your pals, but there's a goblin waiting to stab you in the throat. There's a dragon, there's a skeleton trying to kill you. But with this one, there's none of that. It's just sort of wild animals being wild animals. And nothing's really bad in this book. It's all just happy, everyone's friends, kind of crap. Now, would I recommend this book? No, I can't recommend this book purely because it's just not very good. It doesn't really feel connected to the fighting fantasy world, and you know, it's just sort of it's mediocre. If it wasn't associated with fighting fantasy, I don't think it would have sold. But that's just my personal opinion. I didn't really like this book that much at all. So that's about it for the book. Now onto the channel. Well, a viewer commented that I should look at the Green Spine, the old Puffin books back from the 80s, and that's exactly what I'm going to do, guys. The fighting fantasy content isn't ending here. I am going to be talking about some of the older books in the future, and if I can find like a PDF dump and just go over all of them, I absolutely will. I say that I'm making promises, guys. I'm making promises. We'll see how it goes. If I can only get the physical books, then it's going to be incredibly limited because people online are absolutely gouging for prices. Some of them are just insanely expensive. So we're going to see how that goes, and then obviously I want to rank. I do want to do some ranking videos again. But yeah, the fighting fantasy content isn't going to end here, guys. I think maybe production might slow down just so that I can focus on getting better at making these videos. But really, that's about it for this video. I just want to say thanks to everyone who subscribed. And if you like these videos, feel free to subscribe. I'm not going to nag. But it would be genuinely and greatly appreciated. But without further ado, guys, I'm going to have to say take care. Thanks for watching. Thanks for just being there. Thanks for the support. Hopefully I'm going to see you again, but without further ado, take care, guys. Have a lovely life, have a lovely day, and I'll see you on the other side. Ta-ra.